So, without further ado, I am delighted to welcome Marjorie Feld, celebrating the release of The Threshold of Dissent, A History of American Jewish Critics of Zionism. In The Threshold of Dissent, Marjorie N. Feld instead shows that today's vociferous arguments among American Jews over Israel and Zionism are but the newest chapter in a fraught history that stretches from the 19th century. Drawing on rich archival research and examining wide-ranging intellectual currents, from the Reform movement and the Yiddish left to anti-colonialism and Jewish feminism, Feld explores American Jewish critics of Zionism and Israel from the 1880s to the 1980s. The book positions contemporary critics within a century-long debate about the priorities of the American Jewish community, one which holds profound implications for inclusion in American Jewish communal life and for American Jews' participation in coalitions working for justice. Marjorie N. Feld is a professor of history in the History and Society Division at Babson College. She is the author of Lillian Wald's A Biography and Nations Divided, American Jews and the Struggle Over Apartheid. Feld will be in conversation with Emily Tamkin. Tamkin is a journalist and the author of The Influence of Soros, Bad Jews, and a forthcoming work on Holocaust remembrance. She is a contributing columnist at The Forward and regularly writes for The New Republic, Slate, and The Washington Post, among other publications. So please join us in welcoming to Politics and Prose, Marjorie Feld and Emily Tamkin.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you all so much for being here this evening. I'm so looking forward to this discussion with Marjorie about The Threshold of Dissent. For those of you who have not yet read this book, I'm not just saying this because I'm moderating the talk. It is so bracing and invigorating, and no offense to academic texts, but you don't always get the rigor and thoroughness that this book brings with the sort of accessibility, readability, and verve that this book also brings. So we are going to chat for about 35 minutes and then take audience questions. I know you guys have note cards. Please, be thinking about your questions, jot them down, etc. Okay, so to start out, how did you come to write this book? And I was thinking about this morning. This book is timely, obviously, but it's also part of the point of the book is that it's been relevant long before this current moment. And so how did you come to write the book? And also, what does it feel like to have the book come out at this particular moment?
Well, that's a great question, but I want to start by thanking you for being here and thanking the Politics and Prose folks who've done a great job setting this up. So I'm grateful to all of you for being here and for Emily navigating and moderating and hopefully also contributing. So every Rosh Hashanah, my synagogue makes someone do their Jewish journey. And so I feel as though one of my first questions in interviews is always my Jewish studies journey. How did I come to this moment? How did I choose this topic? Why did I choose this topic? And I think my dissertation was on a progressive era reformer named Lillian Wald, and I was really interested at that time, a long time ago, in questions of Jewish belonging. So Wald, in the progressive era, was a very serious skeptic about Zionism. She died in 1940, but in the 30s she expressed some pretty serious doubts, and she probably was what we would call a non-Zionist. And so I moved from that topic to a second book about apartheid, and I was really interested in that book in the ways that American Jews did and did not join the struggle against South African apartheid. And Israel and Palestine played a huge role in that because Israel had this alliance with South African apartheid. So I see this book as flowing naturally from those questions of Jewish belonging, from the centrality of Israel and unqualified loyalty to Israel as central to American Jewish identity, American Jewish affiliation. So that's sort of the journey, the academic journey. I've been writing this book for a really long time. I teach a lot, and the book really began about 8 years ago. So I just have to say I had no idea that it would be released in an environment like this one, a tragic environment like this one. And so your question is, what does it feel like to have it come out now? I mean, I don't know what word you used immediately after in October, but the word I kept using was bereft. And then the publishers really wanted me to write the book faster, and I found that I was just I was filled with grief. So it was very difficult. I'm happy that the book has found an audience, and I know we're going to talk about that in a bit, but I think that it's been difficult to be an American Jew, and it's difficult to be a person who expresses dissent and studies dissent in this moment when the threshold for dissent is very, very low.
Yeah, so let's get right into it then. You write in the book, consensus refers to a decision held together by broad acceptance. But it seems like throughout American Jewish history, there have been points at which that broad acceptance vis-a-vis Zionism, vis-a-vis Israel, that has been insisted on by leaders and people with authority. So just to give you an example, I was giving a talk once, and the moderator was like the head of a regional head of a Jewish organization. And she said, whatever percent of American Jews are Zionists, whatever percent of American Jews support Israel. And I finally said to her, that's true, but if you ask people what they mean by that, you will get very different answers, right? Like they actually don't all agree on the thing that you're saying they agree on. She did not agree with me, but no matter. But I guess my question is, can you talk about the degree to which, or the tension between consensus and broad acceptance being from the bottom up and being from the top down in American Jewish spaces?
Yeah, it's a great question. It feels like a very journalistic question too, so I'm really happy with it. And that's a great example, right? I think that the book begins in the 1880s, and so I really try to talk about the fact that anti-nationalism, right, because it was before the formal Zionist movement, so it was just anti-Jewish nationalism, began with rabbis. And these were Reform rabbis who were living in a very xenophobic time, lots of anti-Semitism, anti-Asian racism, Jim Crow. And so their anti-nationalism, which then became anti-Zionism, was really grounded in a desire to protect their elite status, to achieve elite status and protect their elite status. They didn't want to be accused of being loyal to another state, and they were very fearful that Zionism was going to make them vulnerable to those accusations, which are, long anti-Semitic canards. So those are Jewish leaders who were some of the first anti-Zionists in the United States, and that's important. They were also marginalized and chastised. The Jewish leaders, like in the federations, or what preceded the federations, formed committees to excise them and to silence them and to tell American Jews that this was very dangerous. So you see this fundamental tension between leaders and lay people. A lot of Jewish leaders who've expressed dissent, rabbis, but also, communal leaders like the ones you were talking to not that long ago, when they have expressed dissent from this artificial consensus, they've lost positions of power, they've been excised from community. I mean, I say this in the book, but I also, and maybe some of you also have had this as your personal experience, people who've had this, who've managed to utter dissent and faced pretty serious consequences. So I try to trace the tension between the top-down imposition of a consensus and the sort of more grassroots, expressions of dissent. That's one of the themes that I try to trace in the book, and it's really up to the readers to decide how well I do in identifying top-down and grassroots coming up.
Another place where you sort of look at these different strains are different. One of the things that I really like about the book is that it's not. It doesn't give into easy binaries, right? It's not like everybody who ever spoke out against Zionism was doing so because they were a progressive, and everybody who ever criticized it, you make very clear that, even as you said at the beginning of this conversation, that there were rabbis who were worried about being accused of having dual loyalty. So could you speak a bit about these different strains motivating anti or non-Zionism in American Jewish history? Yeah,
for sure. So I think that a lot of these pretty elite rabbis, I was giving a talk about these elite Reform rabbis who were anti-Zionist at my own synagogue, and one of the elders in the community said, well, I remember those rabbis, and they had the nicest synagogue, and they drove the nicest cars. They were really elite individuals, and that was a good thing for me to hear. So it may have found its roots, that anti-nationalism and anti-Zionism found its roots in their relatively elite status and their desire to protect it. But several of these rabbis, whose lives I chronicle in the book, really went on to care about Palestinians. I mean, either they went to refugee camps or they talked to members of the Israeli left, which has long been a way that American Jews have come into their dissent. And one way or another, that what maybe originated as something that we might perceive as selfishness or self-preservation and sort of establishment ended up morphing into or evolving into a more sort of comprehensive, maybe human rights-oriented kind of pro-Palestinian thought. The second chapter is about a guy who had a newsletter starting in 48, and it ended when he died in 61. And he was like a Yiddish-speaking lefty who didn't like Zionism for the human rights abuses, who said things like, how are you going to let all the money flow to Israel? American Jewish communal life is going to starve, right? I mean, he was saying these really progressive things. And I'll say, too, even to go back to the elite rabbis for a second, when I looked at their archives, and I was sitting in the archives and finding things like in the 50s, they said things like, gosh, you need to, as members of this, it was called the American Council for Judaism, as members of the American Council for Judaism, you need to, I almost said email, okay. You need to write to your journalistic outlets, to your editors, and tell them every time you publish a Zionist article, you should publish something written by a non or anti-Zionist. It was just in the 50s. So a lot of these concerns, whatever they were motivated by, they're advocating for a more diverse set of voices to be heard from that period through the lefty, that's his name is William Zuckerman, into the 50s and 60s, and then into the 70s and 80s, you have dissenting members of the community as well.
You do have dissenting members of the community in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. And also, one of the things that the book, that feels like a big turning point in the book for the lowering of the threshold is World War II and the Holocaust. Can you speak about how this changes the conversation?
Yeah, of course. I mean, we were just talking about this. You can't have a conversation about Zionism in the United States, about the state of Israel in general, without talking about the Holocaust. You can't overstate its importance, its significance, when you have so many Americans and Jews across the world connected to the devastation and the death and the destruction of the Holocaust. It really became a time when that pain and trauma was tapped into, was utilized, was shaped by this need for consensus. The idea was that at no time has it ever been more important for Jews to present a unified front. And so that had been said before World War II, but it piqued that need and that sense of vulnerability. I mean, of course it did after the Holocaust. And so the sense was, if anyone didn't fall into this consensus or didn't put their support behind it, never has there been a more important time for us as Jews to appear unified. So you can't really overstate its importance, and you also can't think too casually or dismiss all the people who had a deep connection to the Holocaust, as some of the people in my book did, and still said, because we were refugees, we should feel even more keenly that we can't make refugees of another people. So that's what William Zuckerman said in the 50s and 60s. He was watching the war up front in London. He had family who died. And so I think it's really important to consider it as the reason people fell in behind the consensus, and also to think of the courage of the people who were even managing to speak up with personal relationships to the loss of the Holocaust.
And I think you see that today, right? If you go to JVP, or if not now, protests against the war, you'll see signs invoking people's personal family histories.
Never again.
Yeah. Never again for anyone. Now, that's not to say you don't also see invocation of personal family histories in defense of the war in Gaza. But that strain of, not just argument, but that strain of motivation, right, you still do see today.
This is why Emily's new book is going to be so great, because it's about Holocaust consciousness, and I think Holocaust consciousness has been so absolutely fundamental to who we all are, who the Jewish community has become, all sides of all conversations within the Jewish community. In many ways, I'm certainly not belittling it, I'm trying to actually elevate it, but they begin and end with conversations about Nazism and the loss of the Holocaust. I always, and I really want to say this, because I try to say it every time I teach. I do a teach-in, or I do a demonstration, or whatever. I talk about growing up, and I was born in 71, just so you know. So, and I knew at least a dozen people in my synagogue who had numbers on their arms, right? When I went to visit my grandmother, she had people in her condo who had numbers on their arms. And I know that that was absolutely fundamental to who I became. But I was taught, as many of us were taught in those years, that only Israel could keep such a thing from happening again. And so that would just, that is just deep and close for a lot of American Jews, that equation of safety with Israel and with unqualified support for Zionism. And so I don't take lightly the ability of people with personal connections to the Holocaust to be able to dissent. But I also, it was difficult to write about, as I'm sure it will be for you, because the import of it weighs so heavily on American Jewry.
Well, I have, to that point, I have a follow-up, which is, so I asked you this before we came out here. I think there are many American Jews for whom, and I will get back to the actual text of the book, I promise, but there are many American Jews for whom Zionism is an expression of their Jewishness. Support for Israel is one way that they will say that this is how they're showing being Jewish. And if you say, there are some of these same people and others who will say that support for universal rights or liberalism, that's just universal human rights and liberalism and Democratic Party politics. There are many ways in which Zionism is unique, in which I do understand that argument, right? It's the Jewish state, but there are also ways in which it's nationalism, and which the founders of this intellectual project meant it to be just another nationalism, right? And so I guess, and if one listens to the way in which anti-Zionists or non-Zionists are sort of shut up, it's actually not that dissimilar from what an Indian nationalist or a Slovak nationalist might say, right? If you follow these conversations around the world, they don't sound that different. And so I guess my question for you backstage was, why is it, if support for universal human rights and support for a nationalism, if you can find both of these things in the Jewish tradition, and you can also find support for both of these things outside of the Jewish tradition, why is one of them seen as particularist and Jewish, and the other one is not?
I just feel like if I answer that question, I get to be the emperor or something, because it's such a difficult question, I'm not taking it lightly.
No. Well,
I don't
the
mean to be
answer
flip.
not to give people a peek behind the curtain, but the answer that you said was it's tied to the
Holocaust. Yes. I mean, Herzl saw the Dreyfus Affair, right? The founder of modern Zionism witnessed the Dreyfus Affair in France in the 1890s, and he thought, we have to have a state of our own. That was the language, and that's the language I was taught. That's the language I grew up with. Israel equals no more Holocausts. So, I mean, you're getting at one, I don't know if it's the only, but maybe the premier and fundamental contest in Jewish values that I see operating right now, that we are talking about all the time, and we only met a few days ago. But the connection, for those of us who see Jewish identity as being so deeply contested, is very real and very difficult. And that's really what the book is about Jews who, I'm not answering your question, and I know that, but I don't know that there is an answer. The book is about Jews who push back at this artificial consensus. And it's also about, I hope, why Jewish leaders and some Jewish lay folk felt the need for the consensus in the first place. So your question, I guess the answer is anti-Semitism and genocide and the Holocaust. And that makes, I think when I wrote my apartheid book, I was really wrestling with this idea of, because of the Holocaust, Jews can do whatever they want. Because of that loss and devastation, they can form an alliance with apartheid South Africa. They're allowed, they have a license to do that. And then, flip it over, because of the Holocaust, how could we do that? How could we oppress another group? And I don't have an answer to that. And I think that a lot of people, and this is what we were also talking about backstage, Emily, I'd love to hear you talk about it, is that a lot of American Jews are not in one camp or the other, that they're really wrestling right now, as a lot of people in this book wrestled with, how do I belong to the Jewish community and make sense of what's happening in Israel and try to open up more diverse, pluralistic conversations about what American Jewish community and belonging might mean?
Yeah, it makes me think of, there was the former Israeli ambassador to the US who gave an interview and said the lesson of the Holocaust is that Jews should have power. Which is, there are people who think that that's the only takeaway, right? And I think there are people who disagree with that entirely, and I know that there are people who agree with that and also think there are lessons in how that power should be used. So, so you write in the book, we've been talking about leaders and sort of what they wanted and so on and so forth, and you write in the book about religious leaders and political leaders, and I was wondering if you see, we spoke at the beginning about rabbis and their role. Did you see a shift in leadership in American Jewish spaces over time, moving from the religious to the political? And you also quote Professor McGee from Dartmouth early on as saying that Zionism replaced Judaism, which is a spicy quote. I guess the question is, do you see Jewish political leaders as having replaced religious leaders in conversations around Jewish positions on Israel in the United States?
So again, I'm just going to defer to some of the stuff in the book, some of the material in the book, because in the 80s, I mean, when you sit in an archive, right, you're listening to all these voices. It's very quiet. You can't have a pen. It's just you and your camera and your laptop. And I found all these voices in the Reform movement, which is not, the Reform movement is the most liberal of American Jewish denominations, right? And I found these voices in the Reform movement who were talking to American Jews in newspapers. They had the ear of the press, and they said things like, if we are making Israel so central and unqualified support for Israel as so central to American Jewishness, then we're really losing the heart of Judaism. It's becoming a substitute. This was in the 70s and the 80s. And I think it was prescient what they were saying. These were Zionists. Again, these categories are more fluid than perhaps we think. They were ardent supporters of Israel, but they really worried that a synagogue's role is to foster and cultivate spiritual, I don't know what word, nourishment and Jewish continuity, which I know is a freighted word, or phrase, and that when synagogues only police speech, or mainly police speech around Zionism and Israel, that they're not really doing justice to what Judaism has to offer. So those are some of I'm paraphrasing obviously, but those are some of the things that some of the rabbis were saying in the 80s, mostly early 80s. And I would say that if you look at American synagogue life today, it's up to all of us to decide how fulfilling, spiritual we find it. But I do find that synagogues are some of the sites of the most ardent contests over these boundaries and over the threshold of dissent. I think that rabbis and political leaders, in some cases, not all, have really joined forces. Is that what your perception of the way things are right now, Emily?
In some cases, yes. In some cases, I think rabbis and political leaders are in lockstep, and I think in some ways there's a real tussle for who gets to set the consensus. I think on the one hand, you had rabbis who went to Israel and tried to help get aid into Gaza and who protested.
Mine did.
And in other cases, you have rabbis who are there when the New York Times needs a quote saying, what does it mean that, was it anti-Semitism that Josh Shapiro wasn't picked to be vice president because of his position on Israel? So, rabbis are a land of contrasts. But I do think that, I guess the reason that I asked this question is that I sort of think the answer is yes. That the people who are dictating the terms, or not, I shouldn't say dictating, that many of the people who are loudest and most vocal in saying what Judaism means are heads of not religious organizations.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that was really important to me in the book, well, two things I want to say. The first one is that the individuals who are dissenters in the book, I think that we tend to think about Jewish continuity and caring about the Jewish community as maybe those rabbis or Zionist leaders have a monopoly on it. But all of the people in the book that I talk about as dissenters, whatever position they held with regard to Zionism, they were all critics, but they all cared very deeply about American Jewish community. So I think that's really important. Some of them were lay folks, some of them were religious leaders, a lot of them paid a heavy cost for being a dissenter. So I guess that's the most important thing I wanted to say. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would just add that the people that the many of the Jewish people who I know who are involved in speaking out against the war, or who even before the war, who were involved in pro-Palestine, like these were the most, however you want to measure dedication to Judaism, these were the most devoted Jews I knew, right? Like the most knowledgeable, the most all about, like it was the center of their lives. And it was because of that that they were then told that they hated Judaism.
Yeah, so that accusation is very common, right? I've certainly received it myself, that I'm an anti-Semite, that I'm a self-hater, communist, whatever. And those accusations run through the book, beginning in the 30s, right? Before the State of Israel is established. It's also interesting to think about this consensus, and maybe we're coming to this later, but because all of these people paid this high price, right? If they were Jewish and they said something against Zionism or consistently took a position criticizing Zionism, they lost funding, they lost journalist jobs, people wouldn't talk to them. This is what's happening still today. But the result of this is sort of where we are right now, which is to say, by the time I went to Hebrew school, there was nothing about Palestine. I learned nothing about Palestinians. So I think the Jewish world has been really starved of and deprived of information about the history of Palestine, which is sort of both a product and a symptom of the situation that we're talking about here today. It's where we are right now, and I see young Jews, and I'm so heartened by these young Jews. I think of you in that way. I hope that's okay. As making a demand for this material.
Thank you so much for calling me young.
What?
Okay, no, I was complimented. It was taken in the spirit in which it was intended. No, okay, so we've talked about the 30s, we've talked about World War II. There was another moment in the book and in American Jewish history that I wanted to ask you about, which is the Red Scare. I think many have written and talked about, and I myself wrote an article on this, on sort of the parallel between American Jewish organizations and the Red Scare and today, and how what motivated American Jewish groups to work with American authorities and cast out communists and leftists in the Red Scare was a combination of genuine fear over anti-Semitism and also a deep loathing of communists. And how you're sort of seeing a similar thing today with anti-Zionists. But you actually take it a step further and say that with respect to groups like the you write specifically about the ADL, so I don't mean to pick on them, but
Anti-Defamation League.
Right, but because you write specifically about the Anti-Defamation League, you write that their anti-Zionist work was, in fact, a continuation, that their anti-Zionist work, right, that is their work against anti-Zionists, was a direct continuation of their work against anti-communists.
Discuss, that's what you would
Discuss.
say. Right, so again, here's an organization that was founded to protect Jews in a very xenophobic, anti-Semitic, racist era. There were very real fears, and I don't need to tell this crowd probably, about Jews. They wanted Jews to be able to come into the States, right, from all over the world. They were really afraid that communist influence, the communists themselves, their presence in Jewish organizations would prevent Jews from being able to enter the United States, would prevent Jewish social mobility, ultimately what we're talking about is sort of achieve elite white status. So those fears are real. And the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, was founded with those ideas in mind. Its path has been deeply troubling, I think. And I think you probably are talking about the 1974 book that everyone talks about called The New Anti-Semitism, where they wrote this book, these two ADL leaders wrote this book about how we really need to worry about anti-Semitism, and it's all coming from the left, and it's all about hating Israel. And it just is these obscene lumping together, unacademic, not even anecdotal pieces of evidence. And if you read it today, I remember I ran into a really prominent Jewish studies scholar when I was reading the book. Nobody reads the book. It's a terrible book called The New Anti-Semitism. And I said, this is one of the most racist books I've ever read, because so much of it is about how Jewish visibility is being eclipsed by black visibility and the struggle for civil rights. So the ADL has as its goal, sorry, I'm taking a meandering path, but as its goal, keeping Jews safe and sectioning off and purging communists or communist influence or perceived communist influence. There's a very high price to pay for that. And they end up doing a lot of surveillance of organizations that host, all that needs to happen is that the word Arab is in the title of a speech in the 70s and 80s, and they have somebody there, a plant, to sit and watch. So they end up being basically a surveillance and police force that reinforces the consensus. And to this day, I think the work that they do is pretty nefarious and negative, but it has its origins in this very real fear. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Okay, I have 3 more questions, and then we are going to move to your audience questions. So you have note cards. If you don't have a note card, we can get you a note card. So start thinking and passing and writing. There's an element reading this book that this is like the secret history of dissent, and I guess and I guess my question is, and I this is anecdotal, but I've met so many younger Jews in the last however many months or years who will come across a moment like one of the ones in the book and be like, did you know that actually this didn't start with us and this predates us and this has gone through the generations and there's always been dissent? And I guess my question is, why do you feel like there's an element, one, if you agree with the idea that this is kind of a secret or hidden history, and if so, why, like, how did that, why is that?
I mean, all the material I found was open in the archives, right? But I had to get sort of clues from various people about where to find material. And I think the answer lies in complicity, really. Not just complicity. It has to do with the policing of anti-Zionist speech. I mean, the narrative that I was taught, I was a Jewish studies major in college, was this triumphant narrative, this march toward unqualified belief in the state of Israel, and that is what's keeping Jews safe. So that narrative is just reproduced over and over and reinforced by scholarship in ways that have, done this work. It's a symptom of and also reinforced the consensus. So in the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a real opening up, in part due to people like some of the members of the audience, like Carolyn Karcher, and activists who have been looking, I think, for the prehistory, the history of this different kinds of dissent. I think a lot of scholars, even Judith Butler, I read an interview with her a few years ago where she said, oh, the first criticism of Zionism really happened with Brera, with some of these organizations in the 70s or New Jewish Agenda in the 80s. And I was like, no, that's really wrong. But we think that because we're not allowed access to what they said and wrote about, to their critiques that still resonate today. So it feels like a secret history, and I don't doubt that the Black Lives Matter movement and the indigenous rights movement and the Arab rights movement in this country, those taught a lot of activists who were coming of age in the 60s and 70s. They certainly taught me in the 80s and 90s. So, I think that momentum is very positive, and I think that we're seeing the impact of I don't know what word to use, but the resistance to that opening up everywhere these protests happen, and sometimes when I speak. Is that your last question?
Okay, so I have a couple more for you before I move to the audience. Yes, I have time. So in a way, you're breaking with the consensus and trying to raise the threshold of dissent with this book. And so I'm curious what your experience has been in intellectual Jewish spaces as you've tried to do that.
Well, they've been complex. I gave a talk at an If Not Now event, which is a great, it started as an anti-occupation organization. They're being very vocal right now, protesting against the war in Gaza. And there were protests outside. They screamed at me as I exited. They screamed at everybody who attended. I've certainly gotten lots of hate email. So I think that it's complicated. I also did a teach-in for Jewish students right before Passover, and I had 2 Jewish students crying to me, which I cannot handle when young people cry, because they didn't want to go home for Seder. They didn't know how they were gonna. So I think there's a lot of anger for people who are breaking the consensus. Probably you're getting some of it too, Emily, although you're moderating questions right now. But I think it's very difficult. But I mean, let's be honest. I'm sitting here in this chair, right? But the people who are suffering are in Palestine, in Gaza. There are people who are on the front lines. The Palestinian diaspora is in mourning. So I think that it's difficult, but it's certainly not anywhere as difficult as the suffering that others are facing right now.
And then my own last question, which begins with historians never like this question, which is how you know it's a banger. It's a history, but it ends on a forward-looking or forward-inquiring note, and where do you think American Jews, a phrase that you can interpret as you like, go from here on the question of the consensus around Zionism?
Right, so I'm just going to do the biblical quote again, because I was in a Zoom where the rabbi of the Workers' Circle in Boston said that she's investing her hope in this quote from Hallel, which is from Psalms, which is the stone that has been rejected has become the cornerstone. Do you know this quote? But the idea here is that, I mean, the data are in, folks. Like, it's not just young American Jews who are supportive of Palestinian rights, it's young Americans, right? That's the data from April. So things are changing. And folks, I'm in the cohort that's supposed to be very different from my own worldview. I have a lot of peers, and we were just talking about this. We know people, I gave that talk 2 weeks ago, there were people of all ages in the audience. I thought it would be all young folks. I'm really happy when all different kinds of people, diverse ages and identities show up. So I think that there's an urgency to the opening up of this conversation because there's so much suffering happening. And there's also a lot of American Jews who are not going to have anything to do with American Jewish communal life unless there is an opening up. Do you agree?
I often think of it like when you have something precious and so you hold it really, really tight because you're hoping that that will be the thing that keeps it safe. And what you're actually doing is making you're actually helping further the splintering, right? I just think that telling people like, you agree with me or you're not who you know you are is not sustainable.
There's a long tradition of that, sadly, but hopefully it's waning.
Okay, so we are going to move to audience questions. And the first one, I am going to add my own spin on because I have the microphone. No, just kidding. So the question is, does Netanyahu listen to dissent? And is he afraid of being sent to jail if he's forced out of power? But in addition to does Netanyahu listen to dissent, I'm curious as to your view on the connection between, or lack of connection between, criticism of Netanyahu, criticism of Israeli policy more generally, and criticism of Zionism itself. Because you'll have people like, Senator Schumer say Israel should have new elections, like boo to Netanyahu, and then also say, but I hate the ICC because they're so critical of Israel.
I'm not sure. I think you answered the question. He has a lot of power, Netanyahu. He's crushing dissent. I'm fearful for the direction that the Israeli Jewish population is sort of tending. I'll just say, historically speaking, a lot of the American Jews who were moved to take activist steps in the 70s and 80s were in touch with the Israeli left. Like, the Israeli left has been very important to criticism of Zionism in the United States. So I really worry about the direction of Israel, and I worry about American Jews' reliance on unfettered, faith in Netanyahu. I think it terrifies me because he terrifies me and seems to be above every law. He can just act with impunity to crush Palestinians. And his cabinet, in fact, I don't know, I could talk. So in November 2022, right, was the election in Israel. And all these American Jews, some of whom I know, very conservative, were like, oh, Smotrich is in, this was the election of the very conservative cabinet, far right, homophobic, racist, anti-women, et cetera, misogynistic, transphobic. Anyway, and a lot of American Jews were like, oh, we're never going to let these Israeli leaders into our synagogues, into our federations. And then once October 7th happened, all of those opportunities just evaporated. So I think there are occasions when American Jews seem to understand that he's a monster, but this is not a moment like that.
It was really interesting on October 7th, watching the statements from different Jewish groups roll in to the inbox and seeing groups that had been so critical up until that moment sort of snap back to where they were years before. And it's been interesting in the months since seeing how far away from that original statement they've gone. Okay, so we have two from one person who said they were curious on your thoughts about the growing number of anti-Zionist or non-Zionist people becoming rabbis, and also curious about the intersection of political rabbis and their role in this moment. Great questions.
Yeah, so I'm really hopeful. I don't know how to say beyond that. I think there's been can I just use I statements? Because I'm kind of at a loss. I can't speak to like who's in rabbinical school right now, but in my own synagogue, there's a whole cohort of young queer rabbis, and they're all anti-Zionists. And when I see them, I just feel very emotional and hopeful. And I say that, you know, obviously some may perceive it as a sort of a compromise to my objectivity and academics, but I see it as the product of having studied this for so long that I am placing my faith in these inclusive folks who are striving for all kinds of inclusion. And this is the phrase that I keep using in interviews. They're striving for all kinds of inclusion in American Jewish life, not just LGBTQ or class and race and all kinds of inclusion, but also inclusion insofar as we talk about this question from different vantage points, because it is urgently needed. So I have hope that the new generation of rabbis will change this conversation. I don't know if they will. How do you feel?
I think we know that we're seeing more anti and non-Zionist young people go to rabbinical school, and we're also seeing that we're seeing that at some rabbinical schools that's meant that there's been pushback against speakers who have long been supported in coming to speak at those institutions not being so welcome anymore. And we've seen, Zionist students say, well, I don't feel welcome here anymore. So I think yes, it's real. And I think we're also seeing, there was a story a few years ago about rabbinical students who signed a letter criticizing Israel. I know that some of those people were basically told, if you put your name on anything again, you're not getting a job. So, but they're called growing pains because they hurt. So I think, again, it shows that I think whatever your position is on Zionism, Judaism predates and is bigger than Zionism. Okay. Well said. Okay, let's do two together because I think they kind of go together. So one person says, I've always heard that most American Jews were not enthusiastic about a Jewish state, aka Israel, until the '67 war. Can you discuss that? Do you agree, or do you think that's off base? And then the other question, which I think it's related, but you can disagree, is would you speak about the ways in which Jewish people managed to form alliances with American Palestinians and Arab Americans to effectively wield power?
Yes. Okay, so Dov Waxman wrote this really important book, the title of which is escaping me right now, but it's about support for Israel and American Jewry, Trouble in the Tribe, that is the name of it. It's published a few years ago. And he talks about the 50s. I can't remember the phrase he uses exactly, but the 1950s were kind of a lackluster in terms of American Jewish support for Zionism and for Israel. And that the '67 war, the '67 war is what everybody talks about as a watershed moment for American Jewry, because there was this fear that Israel was going to be wiped off the map, because there was this, it was during the civil rights movement and ethnic revivals. And so American Jewry really latched on to the '67 war and onto Israel. But there were still, and in the book, there were still American Jews who were like, occupation. In fact, occupation doesn't sound like something that that a Jew should be engaging in, right? Because this was when Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza began. And one of the things about doing a topic like this, you'll see where I'm going in 1 second, so just bear with me. All the journalists that interview me have personal stories about their aunt or their cousin or their sister or their brother or their neighbor. And I talked to somebody a couple weeks ago who was interviewing me for a story, and she said that her aunt and her uncle hadn't spoken since '67. So here you have these moments where we're in this moment right now, and that wasn't the title of your fabulous story, but it's like, American Jews are more divided than ever before. Guess what? That has been the headline for generations. And those divisions have been fundamental. They've been really the product of and reinforcing the consensus. So I think it's really important that we look at the history of these divisions and reckon with the fact that there have always been American Jews who dissented from Zionism before '67 and also supported Zionism. But that '67 made things a little more difficult because a lot of really prominent American Jewish voices said, well, you can criticize Vietnam, but Vietnam does not equal Israel. And they were saying that because a lot of civil rights leaders and Arab American leaders were like, hey, we're fighting this unjust war in Vietnam, and we're also supporting an unjust regime, settler colonialist regime in Israel. That was a part of these lessons of the anti-colonialist movements. And so the second question is a great one, right? One of the things that I'm reckoning with, and certainly when Black Lives Matter movement came to the fore, and has remained in the fore, is the ways in which support for Zionism has really alienated American Jewish leaders and organizations from these progressive campaigns. When the Black Lives Movement, I don't know if you remember, when they released their platform and there was a prominent statement, right, Carolyn remembers, there was a prominent statement supporting Palestine, a lot of American Jewish organizations went bananas and they said, this is a threat to our security, this is not safe, this is perilous, it's anti-Semitic. But, then when the national conversation changed because of Black activists and their allies, a lot of these organizations just removed from their website their resistance to this platform. So that to me was very illustrative of the fact that Zionism has kept American Jews in a very precarious place. We have not been fighting the right with Muslim Americans and Black Americans and other allies. We belong in those coalitions, I think, according to my worldview, because xenophobia and anti-Semitism are interconnected, and these are the allies that can help us fight those forces. So, you write about this too. You should talk about pushing Jews and bad Jews.
Yeah, I think one thing that one hears often is, well, and certainly after October 7th, is like, well, like these groups weren't here for me, so why should I be here for them? And it's like, okay, first of all, you also live in this country, and thus standing up to preserve its pluralism and its liberalism and your freedoms of expression and assembly and worship, like that's also fighting for yourself. You're not doing this just out of the goodness of your own heart. And second of all, like, if people who agree with you on every other progressive cause do not agree with you on this, perhaps it's worth interrogating whether this is indeed a progressive cause. Like, I think there was or whether or not it fits in with the rest. I think for a long time, American Jews said, okay, we have Zionism, liberalism, and patriotism, and these things all fit really neatly on top of each other. And I think what we're seeing now, and have been seeing for some time, as you write, is like maybe that's actually not true, and maybe it hasn't been true for a while. So you bring up pushing Jews, and I'm going to, it ties into a question that somebody had. Pushing Jews is the name of the last chapter in my book, Bad Jews, not to wear white to someone else's wedding, it'd be like, how about my book? But it's basically about Jews who are sort of pushing
What analogy did you just make?
It's about Jews who are sort of pushing the boundaries of what has been in American Jewish spaces. And I think one of the things, I was thinking about this when you were speaking about the young queer rabbis, is that I think often people who find themselves on the boundary, on the periphery, as it was called by sociologists in the 20th century, because they already feel like they're on the periphery in some ways, or look at what's on the other side of that line, right, and say, maybe I can bring others here with me. And so it's not that surprising to me that there are many queer Jews who are also working for Palestinian rights. It's not that surprising to me that there are Jews of color who are working for Palestinian rights. Now, it's not only I also know many Jews and have interviewed many Jews who grew up like in all-white Jewish day schools who are there at the protests as well, and who are very critical as well, and having fights with their moms and dads too. But I do think that for all of the insistence in the 20th century that American Jewish leaders concern themselves with the core and not the periphery's got a lot to say, and is worth being listened to. So relatedly, somebody asked, with the diversity of Jewish opinions on Israel, how do you see some of the Zionist/non or anti-Zionist schism as a product of class? A product of class.
That's an excellent question. And class was very much a part of in typical, if not now, Jewish activist character. After my presentation at this meeting, everybody did breakout groups, and they were all talking about themselves, which was great. And a lot of a lot of these people who showed up at this event were talking about growing up working class and how that shaped their sense. It may actually relate back to your idea of the periphery, right? Because so much of what we think of as American Jewish life, institutional life especially, is sort of grounded in middle class status and the suburban synagogue, probably.
And summer camp and Jewish day school and all these things that are very expensive to be able to participate in.
Yeah, so the more working class Jews, urban mostly probably, many of whom were not uplifted into social mobility, did not necessarily benefit from whiteness, had all kinds of other categories of identity intersecting. I certainly think it could be operative in the way, in sort of the tensions that we're talking about. It may reinforce or contribute to these tensions. I don't know enough to say for certain, historically speaking, but it seems to.
Yeah, and I think it's not one-to-one, right? So, for example, we know that about a fifth of American Jews live below the poverty line, and we know that many of the Jews who do, are either traditionally Orthodox or they are Russian Jews or ex-Soviet Jews. And these do not tend to be communities that are more progressive on this issue. And there are
That's a great point.
Right? So I think I think what we shouldn't do is make it sound like the poor in the cities or at the protests
we don't want to be
and the rich in the sub,
yeah,
right? But
course.
But I think one can also see how in individual cases not coming up through the upper middle class, sort of Jewish institutional system might
as I did, and maybe you did too. Yeah.
might allow someone to see
positions you differently.
Exactly,
yeah, for sure.
exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, we have two last questions, unless there are any other cards out there, in which case I think we have time for three. But one person says, wasn't the establishment of a Jewish state already right before World War II? The Balfour Declaration was 1919, so maybe the Holocaust was only the last straw, and hence the portrayal of the Holocaust is an overstatement. So basically the idea that this was all already in motion. I guess while you think of the answer to that, I'll say that's one can see how this could already be in motion, and the support for it would already be in motion, and the dissent would already be in motion, and also how this unthinkable tragedy would upend how people spoke about it, right? And their support or lack of support for the state.
Yeah, I mean, of course, the questioner is completely right that it was all in motion, and the colonialist project of Israel was already beginning. Still, that doesn't diminish the power of the language of Holocaust consciousness on the building up of the Zionist project, on support from American Jews. So that's, I guess, what I would say. And I would look to your next book to learn more about that. No pressure.
Yeah. Okay, so this last question, I'm going to, again, add my own question to it. So this person wanted to know, could you give some examples of how anti-Zionist scholarship has been suppressed? And to that, I would add, this is a sort of a lazy question, but I also want to know the answer, so I'll ask it. Are there, not to make you do my job, but are there moments in the book, or is there a moment in the book that you have found yourself thinking of recently as having parallels to the moment that we're in now?
Yeah, so the book has gone through so many iterations, and there were, actually consensus was in the title at one point. No consensus, of course, is what it was called. But there were more sort of historical walks through historiography, which is a deadly word, which is what we're trained to write. Like, this historian said this, and this historian said this. There were books written, for instance, about the American Council for Judaism, which you probably know about, that were just completely shot down by American Jewish historians. Every time a scholar sort of encountered one of these anti-Zionist thinkers, if they tried to publish it within Jewish studies, a lot of Jewish studies scholars, again, sort of reading this as stepping outside the consensus, endangering American Jewry, would shoot it down, would review it poorly. The person might not get tenure. I mean, these are very real dynamics within American Jewish scholarship. It's actually the reason I studied US history instead of Jewish history. That was the route I took because I was watching this unfold in the 90s. So I don't want to give you specific examples, but I think that's probably enough said.
Yeah, and I mean, we see today that Raz Siegel, who's a scholar of genocides, came out very soon after the war started and wrote for Jewish Currents, this is a textbook case of genocide, and people agreed, did not agree, said, yes, absolutely, no, how could you? No, it's not yet, but it could be at some point. And he was going to get an academic position, and that has since been revoked.
He lost it, that's right. And that's one of many, many examples. But your question about a moment, I mean, I keep talking about Marty Blatt, and if you read the book, maybe you remember the name, but I was just so happy because last week I got to give a talk in front of Marty Blatt. So in 1972, he entered Tufts University. He was like a Kennedy kid and a liberal Zionist from Brooklyn. I had a grandfather perish in a Nazi camp. His grandmother made it out. Anyway, he was sort of schooled in the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, and he offered this course. I'm going to say this really quickly. He offered this course at Tufts called Zionism Reconsidered. This was in 73, folks, 1973, and the Jewish world went bananas. I shouldn't be so flip about it, but that's really the best word. The Jewish Defense League, which was a far-right racist organization, interrupted his class. And so this far-right Jewish organization interrupts his class. They spat on him. They issued a declaration. Somebody called his house and said his grandparents shouldn't have been saved. I mean, the Jewish world starts allying itself, no surprise, with the JDL and saying that this course is a threat to American Jews, I went into the Tufts archives and I looked at the letters from parents of Tufts students, from Jewish community leaders and lay people in Boston. And his course, which was a very balanced course, he got great course evals, which is something every professor wants. He was teaching it from a very balanced perspective, but because he dared threaten this consensus, he was targeted by a far-right organization, and then the whole Jewish community sort of latched onto this. It got press all over the country. So I guess what I would say, and before he offered this class, he thought that the Hillel at Tufts was too Zionistic, so he formed a non-Zionist caucus at Hillel and was expunged from the Hillel organization. So these stories we think of as, I don't know, what do we think, 2010, 2015? Like these were happening in the 70s. And these ripples, we're just seeing new chapters, we're seeing the ripples and the implications of these things still today. His voice is so essential. Was essential in 73. He's still doing so much work in American Jewish communal life to open doors and to listen to more diverse voices even now. So I think that's the episode that I keep coming back to, because we need to know that there were precedents and we need to know that the urgency is still very real.
There's a quote that I love that goes, "Is there any people like the Jewish people that talks about itself so much but knows itself so little?" And I wanted to thank you for bringing us a little closer to knowing ourselves a little better with this book and also in your conversation with me this evening. Thank you so much to all of you. Your questions were wonderful, sincerely. Thank you so much. Thank you to Politics and Prose, and really give it up. I highly encourage you, if you do not already have this book, to buy this book and to have it signed this very evening here at Politics and Prose. Thank you guys so much. Thank you.